Ethan Harrison's quiet vacation took a devastating turn when his elderly mother was attacked by a group of fake HOA enforcers with no real authority. Their cold, heartless cruelty towards Carol ignited a fire in Ethan, who would stop at nothing to expose their fraud and restore his family's safety. But it was his position as Secretary of Defense and his unwavering determination that turned the tide, setting in motion a series of events no one saw coming. But just wait until you hear how the story ends. Justice, at last, was served in the most unexpected way. Ethan Harrison had always kept his distance from his hometown. His career as Secretary of Defense demanded his full attention, often pulling him away from the comforts of home and family. But this particular week, he was on rare leave, tucked away in a quiet cabin by a serene lake, far from the political chaos and constant security alerts that normally dominated his life. It was supposed to be a time for him to unwind, to relax, and to breathe. He had just sat down with a cup of coffee, the steam rising in the cool morning air, when his phone rang. The caller ID flashed his hometown's area code. Ethan answered with the expectation of a routine call, maybe a check-in from an old friend or a reminder about his next obligation. Instead, his heart dropped into his stomach when he heard the voice on the other end. "It's your mother. We need you to come home. It's bad, really bad." His mind raced as the words settled in. His mother, Carol, had been living alone ever since her stroke 5 years ago, confined to a wheelchair. Her condition had left her vulnerable, her independence shattered. Though she had caregivers, Ethan had always worried about what could happen if someone took advantage of her. He just never thought it would happen like this. The voice on the other end belonged to a neighbor, a man Ethan hadn't heard from in years. "They came this morning, Ethan. Some men, they dragged her off the porch. They said they were from the HOA, something about violating property codes. They had badges, but they weren't real." Ethan felt his chest tighten. His mind went blank for a second, trying to process the words. His mother, his sweet, frail mother, had been yanked from her porch, treated like a criminal in her own home. He snapped to action without another thought. His vacation, his peace, no longer mattered. His mother did. "Stay there. I'm on my way," he said, trying to steady his breath. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest now, the cold fire of fury rising within him. What kind of people would do something like this? The answer gnawed at him as he grabbed his keys, heading for his car. He had spent years keeping a low profile, hidden in the shadows of his position. But this was different. His family, his mother, this wasn't something that could be ignored. The thought of those strangers, those imposters, touching her, treating her with such disregard, stoked the embers of a rage that Ethan hadn't felt in years. He was accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands, perhaps millions. But this was personal. With each mile he drove back to his hometown, the world seemed to narrow. His mind raced through possibilities, trying to connect the dots. Who were these men? Why target his mother? What kind of world allowed such cruelty to go unchallenged? All of those questions collided with a single, undeniable truth. He wasn't just Ethan Harrison anymore. He wasn't some bureaucrat working behind closed doors. He wasn't just the man in charge of national security. He was a son fighting for his mother's dignity. As the city limits sign came into view, his hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, he was going to make sure that the people who did this would never harm anyone again. By the time Ethan pulled into his childhood driveway, the sun had dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet street. His pulse was still racing, his hands tight on the wheel, every inch of his body vibrating with a mix of anxiety and fury. He barely remembered the drive. His mind had been focused on one thing: getting to his mother. As he slammed the car into park, his eyes locked on the porch. It was worse than he had imagined. Carol was inside, and Ethan could see the faint outline of her silhouette through the window, still in her wheelchair, no doubt shaken by what had happened. The men were still there, 3 of them, standing on the porch with smug expressions, as though their actions were no more than a casual inconvenience. They were laughing, tossing words back and forth, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. These weren't ordinary criminals. They were imposters, playing at being the HOA enforcers, dragging a vulnerable woman from her home without a care for the consequences. Ethan's first instinct was to call the police. But then, like a cold wave washing over him, it hit him. He wasn't just a civilian. He wasn't just a man with a family. He was the Secretary of Defense, a man with the resources, the connections, and the authority to make this right. His fingers brushed the phone in his pocket, but he quickly slid it back in. The moment he made the call, the game would change. He wouldn't get to control the narrative. He wouldn't be the one holding the power. No, he needed to handle this himself, and he needed to do it now. As he stepped out of the car, the air around him seemed to sharpen. The tension in his chest tightened, the anger seeping through every fiber of his being. These men didn't know it yet, but they had made the worst mistake of their lives. With each step, Ethan's mind shifted into a mode he hadn't activated in years, a mode that came with the weight of countless decisions, the kind that affected national security, that required precision and cold calculation. These were the skills that had kept him alive through years of political warfare, but they were also the skills that would make these men regret ever stepping foot on his property. When he reached the porch, one of the goons glanced up, his expression mocking. He made a half-hearted attempt to stop his comrades from laughing at some joke. But the moment he locked eyes with Ethan, that smirk faded into something like confusion. Ethan's voice was deceptively calm, too calm, as if he were giving orders in a secure briefing room, not standing face-to-face with trespassers who had crossed a line they could never undo. "You don't know who you're messing with," Ethan said, his words measured, yet filled with a quiet venom that seemed to make the air between them crackle. The goons didn't move, didn't flinch. One of them scoffed, clearly thinking Ethan was just another angry civilian, too caught up in the emotions of the situation to think straight. But their dismissal was the last mistake they would ever make. "Yeah, right," one of the men sneered, looking him up and down, no doubt trying to make sense of the tall, imposing figure in front of him. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" The answer came like a punch to the gut, cold and undeniable. Ethan straightened his back, his presence suddenly larger than life, like the weight of his office filling every inch of the space. "I'm the Secretary of Defense," he said slowly, making sure each word hit with force. "And you've just made the biggest mistake of your lives." The goon blinked, then looked at his companions, clearly unsure of what to do. They had expected fear, confusion, maybe even a compliant plea for mercy. What they hadn't expected was a man who was calm, composed, and in control of a power they had no understanding of. Ethan took another step forward, his eyes cold, his jaw tight. The fake enforcers stood there, momentarily paralyzed. It was clear they hadn't believed him, but that doubt was beginning to dissolve in the face of his authority. They were out of their depth, and they knew it. Ethan didn't need to raise his voice or throw threats. His mere presence, the knowledge that he had the resources to dismantle their lives with a single call, was enough to send them scrambling. He could feel the shift in the air, a shift they wouldn't be able to recover from. "You're going to leave, now," Ethan continued, his voice cold, unwavering. "And if you ever come near my family again, I will make sure that you never work another day in your lives." One of the men took a step back, eyes darting to the others for confirmation. But none came. Ethan had already seized control of the situation, and with the force of his words, the goons knew they had no choice but to comply. They turned to leave, their arrogance replaced by the sinking realization that they had underestimated the wrong man. Ethan stood tall, watching them retreat, his heart still pounding in his chest. But there was no satisfaction in the victory, not yet. He had dealt with them, for now. But what came next? That was the real question. The air around Ethan crackled with tension as he stood motionless on the porch, watching the fake enforcers scramble to gather their bearings. The moment they had realized they were up against someone with real power, their bravado had crumbled. But the game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ethan's phone was already in his hand, his fingers dialed into his contacts with military precision. The words he spoke were curt, measured, commands, not requests. "It's time. I need federal agents here, now." He didn't give them time to question or hesitate. His reputation alone was enough to make them move swiftly. The urgency in his tone left no room for debate. His mother had been dragged from her porch like a piece of garbage, and Ethan was done waiting for justice. The goons shifted uneasily, their faces losing whatever confidence they'd had earlier. As their eyes flicked nervously toward the street, they could feel it, an impending sense of doom they couldn't shake. And then, as if on cue, the unmistakable sound of sirens cut through the air, a sharp reminder that the authorities were on their way. The pressure was building, and panic was setting in. Ethan stood tall, unwavering, his posture that of a man who had faced far worse than a group of fake enforcers. He wasn't just a politician anymore. He was a force, a symbol of the system that would not let this kind of lawlessness slide. By the time the first black SUV pulled into the driveway, the men were visibly sweating. They had misjudged Ethan. They had underestimated him. The reality was setting in that they were not going to escape this easily. They'd been careless, arrogant, and now they would pay the price. Federal agents swarmed the porch, moving with precision, their eyes scanning the scene with practiced efficiency. The goons, now out of options, looked like cornered animals. Their defiance had vanished, replaced by the hollow resignation of men who knew their time had run out. Ethan didn't flinch. He watched as the agents handcuffed the men, their faces a mix of shock and fear. There was no trace of sympathy in Ethan's eyes. This wasn't about retribution. It was about accountability. "Take them away," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. As the goons were ushered into the back of the federal vehicles, one of the agents pulled Ethan aside. The agent was a familiar face, someone who had worked with him before during high-profile cases. "They're connected to a much larger operation," the agent said in a low voice, glancing at the departing men. "They're part of a scam targeting homeowners all over the state. They've been posing as HOA enforcers, intimidating people, collecting bogus fees, and threatening to foreclose on properties. But this was something else." Ethan's mind raced, his instincts already working to piece together the bigger picture. The scam was one thing, but why his mother? Why target a vulnerable, elderly woman who could barely defend herself? What had she been caught in the crossfire of? The agent continued, "We're tracking the whole network. There's more to this than meets the eye. We'll dig deeper, but you need to know, this isn't over." Ethan nodded, the weight of the situation settling in. He could feel the anger still simmering beneath the surface, but there was a growing sense of urgency. The goons were just the first step. The true masterminds behind this had to be out there somewhere, and Ethan was determined to find them. He turned back to the house, the door creaking open as he stepped inside. His mother was still in the same spot, her frail body hunched in her wheelchair, her face pale with fear. But when she saw him, the tension in her eyes seemed to fade slightly, as if her protector had finally arrived. Ethan kneeled down beside her, gently taking her hand. He wanted to say something comforting, something to ease the burden she must have felt. But the words didn't come easily, not when the truth of what had happened was still sinking in. "Mom," he said quietly, squeezing her hand, "you're safe now. I promise you, I'll make sure no one ever does this to you again." She nodded weakly, the tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I should have never opened that door." Ethan shook his head, wiping away a stray tear. "This isn't your fault. You don't ever have to apologize for this." But deep down, the question still gnawed at him. Why her? Why this house? And more importantly, who was behind this? Ethan wasn't the kind of man who left things unfinished, and this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. He wasn't going to rest until he had the answers. And when he found them, The people responsible for threatening his family were going to learn just how far Ethan Harrison would go to protect what was his. The fight was far from over. The story erupted across the media like a storm, capturing headlines nationwide. The public's outrage was swift and intense. What had been done to Carol Harrison, a defenseless elderly woman, had struck a chord in the hearts of many. The details were ugly. Fake enforcers posing as legitimate authority figures, terrorizing homeowners and swindling them for money. But now, with the arrests of the perpetrators, the truth was out, and the scandal was unfolding with all the force of an unstoppable wave. News outlets were abuzz with the details of the fraud, and the story quickly became a symbol of justice triumphing over corruption. Ethan, once a figure who moved in the shadows, now stood in the spotlight. His quiet, steady demeanor in the face of his mother's mistreatment had struck a chord with the public. It wasn't just his position as Secretary of Defense, it was the sheer determination and love he showed in protecting his family that made him a hero in the eyes of many. The satisfaction for Ethan wasn't just about seeing the criminals arrested or their network dismantled. It was about the justice he had fought for and the weight that had been lifted from his shoulders. The fear that had gripped his mother's life, the terror she'd lived with every day, was slowly beginning to fade away. Ethan sat beside Carol on the porch, their eyes catching the warm light of the late afternoon sun. The silence between them was comfortable now, peaceful. Carol, her frail hands still trembling ever so slightly, rested her head on Ethan's shoulder. There was something in the way she looked at him now, a deep gratitude and a trust that had been restored. Her eyes, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now reflected relief. Ethan glanced at the horizon, his thoughts momentarily drifting from the events of the past few days. He could feel the weight of everything lifting, not just for his mother, but for himself as well. He had always been used to keeping his emotions locked away, buried beneath layers of responsibility. But this fight, this battle for his family's safety, it had unlocked something inside him, something deeper than duty. "Are you okay, Mom?" Ethan asked softly, his voice steady but filled with concern. Carol nodded, a quiet smile breaking across her face for the first time in days. "I'm fine now, Ethan. I'm fine." For a brief moment, it was as though the world had paused. Everything was right again. Ethan's heart, which had been tight with anger and worry, began to soften. They had made it through the storm, and though the echoes of the ordeal would linger for a while, they could now rebuild. Carol was free from the fear that had overshadowed her life for so long. As Ethan sat beside her, he felt something shift within him, a sense of purpose that went beyond duty. This wasn't just about his career or his power. This was about what mattered most: family, loyalty, and the fight for what was right. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come not from grand strategies or battles won in the halls of power, but from standing up for the ones you love. Ethan had fought not as a man of politics or influence, but as a son. And in the end, that was what had made all the difference. He had not only won justice for his mother, but had reminded himself of the strength of his own convictions. He had proven that even in a world filled with corruption and deceit, there was still space for integrity, for truth. The satisfaction wasn't just in the victory, it was in the peace that followed. Carol's recovery, both physical and emotional, was slow but steady. Each day she became stronger, more confident, more herself. Ethan had given her that peace, and for that, he felt a profound sense of vindication. Justice had been served, and Ethan's world, once shaped by bureaucracy and authority, had shifted. He would never be the same, and neither would his relationship with his mother. They had come through the fire together, and though the flames had burned brightly, they had emerged stronger. In the quiet of the porch, as the evening sky deepened into shades of purple and gold, Ethan finally allowed himself a moment of peace. He could hear the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of the wind in the trees. For the first time in a long time, everything felt right. Justice had been done, and the world would know that no one, not even the most powerful criminals, was untouchable, not when there was a son willing to fight for his mother.